change in the directive and the new amendments to the Privacy Directive is just something that is initially looks like a burden to organisations, and what we specialise in is just trying to get rid of any burden in terms of compliance. So for the last year or so, we've been working with companies just to try and understand what it is that you can do with the legislation. So take the legislation, take it apart, deconstruct it, and then put it back into the real world. So what we're going to try and do today is not too much big arm waving, because the time for big arm waving is kind of over. It's now time to address the individual pieces of the legislation and turn around and say, okay, well, what am I going to do? And actually tweak things. So there are things to change on web pages, there are things to change in privacy policies, there are things to change in terms of your commercial agenda. So we've got to make changes. And I'm sure, as Dave will tell you, there's been plenty of time to do this now. The time is to stop pontificating and get something done, get something down on paper, and if you haven't already kicked off these programs, get programs kicked off. So what I propose to do for 25 minutes or so is just give you a kind of state of nation. So I'm going to kind of lean in and say, okay, here are the various changes, just a brief overview, not too much detail. Pick up on some of the guidance documents that have come out from the ICO and some of the guidance that's been around, and then give you as much benefit as I can of all the projects that we've been working on up to date. We've been working on some small-scale organisations, some small organisations have turned around and taken this on board and said, yeah, we're going to do it, but also some global organisations and some EMEA organisations as well. And there are particular challenges, obviously, in terms of multi-jurisdiction and multi-regulators into how we're going to comply with all of this, because we can take a look at the directive, we can take a look at the UK legislation, we can take a look at the stance from UK Gov and UK regulator, but if we're EMEA-based or global-based, then we've also got to ask the question, what do we do about everybody else? If we take a view on compliance in the UK, will the Spanish, will the Germans, will the Italians take the same view? And if not, what are we going to do about it? So these are real practical considerations that I'm going to try and go through for you now. Very big agenda for my bit then, which is, I'm just going to introduce the law check. How many people, is there anybody here who's not listening? Is there anybody here starting afresh? I'm assuming everybody's kind of read the documents and had a look at the changes, or not? It's okay to say no. I've got my lady at the back left. Okay, so I'm just going to start off. I'll just kick in. I won't go into too much detail, otherwise I'm going to be teaching you to suck eggs, but I'm going to tell you what the changes with the law were, but also the practical implications. What does that mean? Then the path to compliance, which is a phrase, did you write it? It's a phrase we kind of nicked from the regulator, which is, look, it's going to be really, really difficult to comply with the black and white of the law. Nigh on impossible in multi-jurisdiction, third-party dropping cookies with container tags, etc., etc. Nigh on impossible. So therefore, all of the programs we're working on are about demonstrating that organisations have taken positive action. They've done something definitive, they're working towards it, and they do give us stuff, frankly. So the path to compliance is about saying we're working on it, we're trying to do our best, we haven't solved this yet, but we're looking for a solution. So we're looking at this path to compliance and trying to work out where you can say, yeah, look, we've actually done something and it's believable, as opposed to just saying, yeah, we're working on it. And also where there are, quite frankly, issues that we currently don't have a technical solution for at the moment. So looking at the path to compliance, and then also looking at some best practice. So where have organisations sat down, looked at this, spent a bit of time, spent a bit of money, and gone, yeah, that's our view on it, that's what we're attempting to do, and I want to try and give you as many examples of those as I can, so that if you haven't already done it, you can turn around and go, yeah, we'll nick that, because quite frankly, if somebody else has come up with a good idea, then there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Okay, so that's basically my kind of 30-minute slot. Ooh, go back. So, okay. So what were the basic changes? So for those of you that didn't sort of track this thing all the way through from several years ago now, European EU Privacy Directive, basic change to one of the key articles in the directive, and it was the requirement to obtain consent for cookies and similar technologies. So most of us were very familiar with the idea of doing something and then asking people to say, did you want it or not? And certainly for all of those that have been involved in email marketing, particularly in the business-to-consumer retail sector, you know we've been asking people for their email addresses, and you know we've been asking for consent for that, and you know that the law has been asking us to make sure that we always give them an opt-out mechanism on the bottom of those emails, safe unsubscribe. So we're all pretty familiar with that concept of the difference between saying, give us your email address, and by the way, can we have your email address for email marketing? And that's kind of like a consent opt-in process. And there was some great guidance document that came out from the ICO about buying drinks in a bar at one point. Somebody about buying you around, is it consensual, non-consensual? There was some great stuff about that. But we all got a handle on what the difference between opt-in and opt-out was. So previously, you could dump all of this stuff onto people's computers, you could drop cookies, you could use JavaScript, you could fingerprint, you could do all of that kind of stuff by having a bit of a root around in the browsers that were on your website and putting information on them and taking it off without having to ask consent. You just had to stop doing it if people asked you to stop doing it. Now it's the other way around. Okay? Now we've got to do it with consent. So this causes a whole bunch of problems. Why was it done? Essentially protecting the privacy of internet users, even where the information being collected about them is not directly personally identifiable. All the projects that I work on, there's the same level of confusion. People go, well, it's just a cookie, it's a number string, it's alphanumeric, we don't actually know who these people are, so we're not going to worry about it. Okay, so this is the first myth we got to bust, is that it doesn't matter. Initially, it doesn't matter whether we can identify the individual or not, because we're identifying a unique browsing session or a returning browsing session. So just because you can't put a name to it, doesn't mean to say that it doesn't count. However, once we start looking at the other piece, which is how intrusive is all of this stuff, a lot of people that we're working with don't realise just how much information they've got. And once they begin to put these data sets together, so you've only got to have a login registration page or an email database, and to tie that up with some of the session cookies or other cookies that you've got, you can very quickly put a name to that particular browsing session if you wanted to do so. By definition, that becomes personally identifiable, and therefore the inference is it's more intrusive. More intrusive means we've got to wake up, smell the coffee, and do a bit more stuff about telling people about what we're doing and how we can identify them. So the law says don't care whether you can identify the person or not. The fix or the approach we take to compliance or consent is that we do want to understand whether we can or cannot identify the individual. It's intended to prevent information being stored on people's computers and used to recognize them, the browser, recognize them, via the device they're using without their knowledge and agreement. Now, I've been doing a bit of vox pops over the last sort of week or so, just asking my mum, my neighbour's auntie, and those kind of people, do they understand when they click the Facebook like button what it actually does? And of course they don't. They have absolutely no idea what's going on in terms of the background. And if you fire up Fire Cookie or something like that, something that shows them this stream of information that goes backwards and forwards when they click, yeah, I like that, they'd be truly shocked. And our job now is to try and get their knowledge and agreement without completely losing them in the depths of social networking, tag containers, double-click, advertising networks, network agencies, and all that kind of stuff. So we've got quite a job. And I understand why when the ICO says, look, implied consent, you have to do that only when people know what's going on. And frankly, a lot of people I talk to right now don't know what we're doing. And actually, a lot of the clients we work with don't know what's happening with the advertising networks that they're working with. And when you drop a double-click container, what actually happens? What does Facebook do? What does Twitter do? So we've got to start working that stuff out so that we can talk to people about it. So this whole consent thing then. So we've been told, we've got law, and the legislation is in force. Okay, it's a year old now, getting on force. So it's in force. We're supposed to be compliant with this stuff. So consent must involve some form of communication where the individual knowingly indicates. Now we've had this stuff for years. You can go back to Convention 108. You can go back to European Directive on Privacy. You can go a long way back, and you can see there's been an awful lot of consistency back through 1995 all the way back to the 1980s, where people have said, if you want to demonstrate to me that somebody's consented to something, they've got to do something. And this is where we're going to get into some really interesting discussion today about inferred consent, implied consent, positive consent, and there's a whole heap of misnomers out there where people misuse terms like implicit, explicit, implied, inferred. Even within legislation, you'll see lawmakers using the words apparently randomly. So we've got to get a grip to this kind of idea of knowingly indicates. Knowingly and indicates. So they've got to understand, we've got to tell them stuff, and then they've got to do something to go, yeah, all right then. And it's that, yeah, all right then action that we're going to spend a lot of time working on. Is it clicking a button? Is it ticking a box? Is it accepting some terms and conditions? Is it merely entering your website and using your website? So these are the kind of issues that we're going to have to address now when we're asked the question by a regulator or by a customer, when did you get my consent to dump all this stuff on my computer, and when did you get my consent to track me across all these multiple networks? Okay, so the individual has to fully understand. Now, you go out and ask people, I've been struggling for the last year to get my head around exactly this whole kind of cookie management, cookie sale, tag containers. It's complicated. So your average consumer is unlikely to understand this at the moment. So we've got a job to do to make sure that they fully understand that by the action in question, they are giving consent. So that means we're going to have to beef up a whole bunch of our information provisions, and we're going to have to do it in a language not that the technical people understand, but that the consumer understands. Setting cookies before users have had the opportunity to look at the information provided about cookies and make a choice about those cookies is likely to lead to compliance problems. Okay, so we've got to start looking technically. So we will start the technical audit process of looking at your website and asking the question, when do you drop all these things? When are the tags dropped? When are the pixels dropped? When do you give the get-give commands? Where are you actually accessing or storing information on that terminal equipment? So technically ask the question, is it on the home page? Does everybody come in to your home page? No. So where are the points of entry into your website? And when they enter the website at that point, what happens? And of course, if you run a very simple sniff pack, just sit there and just look at the cookies, just run fire cookies, see what gets dropped, you'll realize, of course, that all this stuff is happening within probably, if you've got it sus, less than 400 milliseconds or so. So less than 400 milliseconds is what the consumer's got to make a choice. Unlucky. So we've got to start understanding how we work with the legislation, how we comply with the legislation, recognizing that we've got very little hope of getting a consumer to understand about network advertising and tag containers in 400 milliseconds. So they're going to happen. So we're going to take a view on this. So we're going to take a view on the impact on the individual, what the law is asking us to do, and how we can technically comply with it. But what we have got to do is we've got to make sure there's an opportunity of choice here. And of course, this is the big fight that's raging between the US and Europe. US are very happy with their opt-out mechanisms, and Europe has quite clearly gone opt-in. So I suspect one of the things we'll end up talking about today, and we already see it in client implementations of compliance, is they're shifting back towards the NAI, the Network Advertising Initiative, and the initiative that's been kind of backed by the Interactive Advertising Bureau, the opt-out mechanism. So we're going to come up to an uneasy kludge at some point, which is a little bit opt-in, a little bit consent, a little bit EU, and probably a little bit opt-out from the US as well. And it's just the way I see things going. It may not be the way the law wants us to go, or the regulator wants us to go, but that's the reality of where we're heading. And you'll see these two options coming together, the opt-in and the opt-out. And over on the right-hand side there, I've just plucked some images that were taken from the ICO guidance, just to give you some insight as to what the regulator is thinking about in terms of how do you get information across to people, not in 400 milliseconds, but at least how do you get more information to them? So the question is, can we be more prominent? Can we be more proactive? Can we make people read the stuff about this? So it's about making your stuff more prominent. And one of the slides I've got coming up is a slide that picks some guidance from the financial services legislation, the FSA Prominence Code. You sell people a mortgage, you've got to make sure they understand that if they don't keep up payments, their home may be at risk. That really fast bit at the end of every radio ad is not there for a laugh. It's there to comply with the law. And it's about prominence and making people aware. So we might take a leaf out of that book and see if we can use that in some of our web stuff as well. So what we're trying to understand now then is, where do we get this positive signifying action? We're asked to get a consumer or an individual to say, yeah, go on then, you can do all of that kind of stuff with me and my browser. And we have to make sure that it's knowingly indicated. So you can start to see how organizations can perhaps play with some of the words and play with some of the benefit statements that you get when you work with websites and retailers. Look, I get personalized recommendations. What do you think that means? Well, we know what it means, don't we? We know it means that Amazon are tracking my purchases, they're remembering when I come back, they know that they're doing a whole load of recommendation in the background. How are they doing that? Well, they're accessing or storing information on my browser. So we can start to look at the idea, perhaps, of saying, there was a positive click. I logged in. I said, yes, please, give me personalized recommendations. I can browse Amazon without clicking that button, but I lose a whole bunch of benefits. So the trade-off is, Duncan, here's a bunch of benefits you get from allowing us to drop stuff on your website, on your browser, but by clicking that button, what you're doing is you're knowingly indicating that you agree to us accessing or storing that information. And so the job now is to make sure that that click is tied together with knowledge, real knowledge and awareness, so the consumer understands what they're doing. The thing that actually poleaxed me when I read the guidance document, so I read the legislation and I thought, crikey, this is going to be tough, because how do you get a positive indication of knowledgeable consent within 400 milliseconds? Yeah, we're going to have to take all of those tags and all of those cookies off the home page, and we're going to have to stick them behind an airlock, and there was a lot of discussion about how you were going to do this thing. And then we got this one. Okay, so some users might not click on either of the options available. In other words, yes, no. Yes, you can drop cookies, no, you can't, or not clicking. So they may not click on either of the options available. They may go straight through to another part of the website. You don't say. Okay, that's what everybody's going to do. They're going to hit the page, the landing page or the home page, and then they're going to go, I want to buy something. And they'll click on the buy button. They'll go. When they do that, you might decide that you could set a cookie and infer consent from the fact that the user has seen a clear note through and using the site. So, of course, when I saw this, we thought, fantastic. So as long as somebody comes on the site and clicks anything, we can use that click as an indication of consent. But of course, okay, that's a kind of like a, thank you very much for opening the door and allowing us this opportunity. But of course, we have to do this with knowledgeable consent. That click has to be tied to knowledge and information. So this was a great way of saying, okay, I don't have to have the click, I don't have to have the floating banner, I don't have to have a big thing going, cannot proceed unless you click this button. And there's a Dutch website that's put a strict implementation of the legislation up. That's a nightmare. Every time you move the mouse, this thing pops up and says, you have to consent to us dropping a cookie. You have JavaScript. Do you want a JavaScript? It takes 5 minutes just to get the weather off this website. So strict interpretation, really, really difficult for consumers, but perhaps we've got an opportunity here. An opportunity to say, we can get consent as a user uses our website in a normal way, and all we've got to do now is make sure that this notice and consent, the knowledge piece, is in place. Okay, so buried consent. Not uncommon for consent to be gained online using terms and conditions. So you know we stick in our privacy policies and our terms and conditions by using our website you agree to. Okay, so we can start to think about how we might use the standard terms and conditions on a website, perhaps making it more prominent, more readable, more understandable, so that we kind of get people through buried consent. Now, of course, we're on a bit of a tightrope here now, because what we're saying is, are we going to trick people into using our website and sticking a bunch of information on their browsers, or are they genuinely going to have read these terms and conditions and understood what we said in there? How many people look at the web stats on their T's and C's page or privacy policy? How many clicks do you get on? Yeah? None. Nobody reads the bloody things, okay? So, try and get that one past the regulator. Okay, let's have a look at your web stats. How many people read terms and conditions? Oh, geez, nobody. I guess that's not knowingly consenting then. So we've got to be careful about how you use this kind of thing. And of course, the other thing is, with EMEA programs and global programs, this may not be the same interpretation of the legislation. That's another issue we've got to address. So can we use T's and C's? Well, certainly if they register or sign up, well, there's a wake up and smell the coffee moment. You signed up, you asked for personalised recommendations, and you ticked a box that said you read and agreed to our T's and C's. So our job now is just to tease out the important stuff from those T's and C's and make sure it's not buried. Germany. Who's operating in Germany? Okay? Be afraid, be very afraid. Okay, the issue in consent is under Telemediadienst and TMD and UWG, under those legislation, we've got some other bits and pieces coming up through through local law and common law in Germany that says consent cannot be buried in another document. You'll just trip at the first hurdle. So we're going to have to pull that consent mechanism out. It's got to be in red. It's got to be in bold. It's got to be a separate HTML page to satisfy German law. So don't bury consent in your standard T's and C's for German customers. It won't work. So there is no reason why consent for cookies cannot be gained in the same way. And I agree. There's no reason why it can't be, because it's somebody clicking, it's a positive indication, and as long as they've understood what's going on, it'll meet the requirements of the law. The problem is, nobody reads them, and you've read the privacy policies and T's and C's. They're impenetrable, most of them. Certainly the Apple one is. On an iPhone, it's 168 pages long. You know, at which point do you get to the bit that says, oh, by the way, we're going to drop something on your app, so that on your mobile, so we can track you. Now, we also have a problem about reconsenting. So we've got existing users will have to be reconsented. So says the guidance documentation. So if we change our terms and conditions or our privacy policy, we kick off a project today, and off we go, and we up-rev our privacy policy, and we put a load of stuff in there about how we not spy, that's the wrong word, about how we track and how we use analytics and do all that kind of stuff. We are then supposed to positively reconsent all of our customer base. Do you know, that never happens. In my experience, you just do a quick Google on privacy policy check back. Okay, there are pages and pages and pages where people say, from time to time, we may change our privacy policy. Please check back regularly to see the fact that we've absolutely screwed you. And of course, nobody ever checks back, and there is never a mechanism on these changes to say, oh, thanks for telling me about the changes, I don't agree with them. Anybody ever do that? No. Okay, so just watch out for this one. Getting somebody to agree or to reconsent to a change in a privacy policy ain't going to happen. Just isn't going to happen. Experience says nobody will do that kind of stuff. So we've got to think carefully about how you make those changes. Okay, so here's the sort of thing we've been talking about then. Here's the Amazon privacy notice. This notice describes the policy. By visiting Amazon, you are accepting and consenting to the practices described in this policy. Okay, so positive indication, using the site, signing up. Somewhere in here could be information that ensures that they knowingly consent. Of course, what we've got to do is make sure that somewhere in there, third one down, what about cookies? So I haven't pulled that one up, but this is the kind of thing we've got to do, and in Germany, be very, very careful about burying it in this one document. Analytics, not exempt, but. Okay, so in practice, we would expect you to provide clear information about analytical cookies and take what steps you can to seek agreement. Highly unlikely that the ICO is going to prioritize Google Analytics. Okay, fair enough. This is getting to the heart of the issue, which is, really, it's not about stopping us measuring stuff. It's about if what we're doing is intrusive on individuals. So we've got to start looking to see whether what we're doing is simply counting visitors, trying to work out how long they stay on our website, where they go, or genuinely, are we using this information for retargeting them? Are we selling this information on? Are we sharing this information on? What would individuals say if they knew we were doing this stuff? If you told them you were counting how many pages they looked at, they'd go, whatever. If you told them that what you were doing is trying to understand how many of those particular websites they had been on, where they came from, where they go to, now they might be a bit more concerned. Okay, so as far as analytics are concerned then, we've got to put something in place to highlight the use of cookies. Okay? This isn't going to be difficult. We can do this fairly straightforward through information provision and through privacy policies. The tricky thing is trying to understand what you do with that analytical data. How much of it is shared, is passed on, how much of it is intrusive. Okay, FSA prominence rules then. Does the FSA help us out here? This is something I've been looking at. This sort of thing here where they say, look, here's the stocks and shares, you can change between global funds, there's no initial charge, and then there's some small print. This is the sort of thing that the FSA go, nah, okay? You're pulling the wool over people's eyes, you're mis-selling financial products. If you do so, be prepared to feel the wrath of the regulator. And what the regulator says here in the FSA is, pull that stuff out, guys. Come on, actually there is a management charge. You know, be upfront about this stuff. Oh, by the way, the value of your investments may go down as well as up, so watch out, smell the coffee. So you can see the FSA, and this is true of websites as well, saying you've got to do something like this to make the user understand what is actually happening. So your job now is to identify what you're doing with analytics and with tags and with pixels and with clear GIFs and all that kind of stuff, and then make people aware that their investments may go down or up, that you can identify them, that you can track them, that you do know the referring sign. Okay, so obtaining consent then. Browser settings not sophisticated enough, so pop-ups are ugly, so let's think about using terms and conditions. So some of the programs we're working on, we just got rid of all of those JavaScript pop-ups and all of that kind of stuff and WordPress plugins. You know, that's not going to happen. We're not putting all these pop-ups. We're going to go for this inferred consent route, but it's going to be informed and we're going to work carefully on the information. So, third-party cookies, Facebook, all that kind of stuff. ICO guidance advise anybody whose website allows third-party cookies to make sure that they are doing everything they can to get the right information to users and allowing users to make informed choice. So, what's the right information? The right information is actually quite difficult to get to. You've got to start digging around in your Facebook privacy policies, your Google, your Omniture, your Site Catalyst, all that kind of stuff. Start digging around and find out what they're actually doing, and then you'll be able to give them the right information at the right time. Are they a law unto themselves? Yes. Okay? You're the site controller. Despite the fact that the legislation says they're supposed to get consent, you're the ones that are making it happen. You stuck the Facebook-like thing on your page. Okay? So, you've got to somehow go out there, understand what third parties are doing, and get some of that knowledge transferred across to the consumer, to your web users, so they understand it as well. And then you've got to give them a choice. How do you give them a choice about that kind of stuff? How are you going to turn off all that third-party stuff? Any ideas? No. Okay? So this is where US and EU begin to merge together. Because if you want to stop Google advertising, if you want to stop Omniture, if you want to stop all of those network agents or network advertising networks, if you want to stop all of those, you ain't going to do it by pop-ups on your website. Agree, agree, agree. You're going to do it by going and using something like the Network Advertising Initiative or the Online Choices and saying, here's how you drop a kill cookie and turn that stuff off. Okay, so last couple of minutes then, I just want to show you a few things just about what's going on. So we've picked up a couple of websites, some of the websites that we're looking at. Yeah, this is the kind of stuff, show your mum this. I'm sure she'll be happy. Yeah, this is what happens when you click on a Facebook link within 25 or 229 milliseconds. There's just a stack of stuff going on there. Average consumer isn't going to understand it. Your job is to turn that lot into a couple of snappy sentences that people will go, yeah, all right then, or no thanks. So there's quite a bit of work to do in the technical audit to understand what's going on in the background. What did John Lewis do? They turned around and said, okay, well, there you go, bang, FSA prominence right there at the top nav bar, not below the fold. You know, stuck up at the top where people can see it. Here's all the stuff that was going on in the background, even when you click on their privacy and cookies thing. And what they did was they said, look, here's not just a privacy statement, here's a whole bunch of stuff about cookies, and it's all tabbed, look. What are they? Here's our policy. There's third party. Here's how you manage them. Here's how bad. Okay? So they've gone the extra mile. They've done something that said, you know, we've really taken this on board and we've gone the extra mile. And they've said, okay, what are cookies? And they've even said, look, we do have relationships. We do set cookies. We are going to use them for remarketing. You know, there's that kind of, wow, we are going to target you guys and we are going to remarket to you. And what they've done is they've they've linked off to the NAI opt-out. So they've taken a very strong view here and they said, you know what, we can't get your opt-in consent for all this stuff, but we are going to give you a choice. We've informed you and we've given you a choice. And now you can go and opt out from that stuff. So this is where we're beginning to see the merging of that stuff. Okay, so your compliance strategy then has got a bunch of things you need to consider. You've got your technical stuff, okay? All that fire cookie. You've got to do a technical review. You've got to understand what you're dropping, when you're dropping, and how you're putting all that information together, merging different data sets. You've got to do a commercial review. You've got to understand that if the regulator turns around and says, turn it off, you need to know whether you're going to fight that corner or not. Because if it's a major revenue stream that you're about to turn off, you're going to fight, and you should. You should push back and go, no, commercially, this is very important to us. If the regulator turns around and says, you still want to turn it off, now at least we know we're going to fight to find out another way of achieving what we were achieving through cookies, because we're not going to kill that revenue stream off. So make sure you tie these two things together. Legal, okay? Multi-jurisdictional. If we're just working on a webinar program at the moment with a client to bring in legal counsel from all the European countries to sit them in a virtual room and say, what is your regulator saying? Because if we put a solution in place that is inferred consent and the Italian regulator just turns around and says, on your bike, we just wasted a lot of time and money. So from a multi-jurisdictional perspective, you're going to have to pull all these people in together. And cultural. Okay, you can be right until you're blue in the face. If customers expect to have a tick box, and in Germany they do, have one. Otherwise they'll just wander off to a competitor. So think carefully about all of those key issues. Okay, so what does it look like then? You're going to do a PIA, a technical impact assessment, and a commercial risk assessment. Okay, your PIA looks at how intrusive stuff is. Your technical impact is what functionality would be lost if we had to turn it off. And your commercial risk is what is the revenue loss or gain if we have to turn this stuff on or off. So make sure you've got those three key things in your program. We've got plenty of time to talk about this stuff later, but I'm going to go into that. And then if you just drill down into that then, I'm going to ask you to make sure you audit all of the objects on all of your sites. Okay, all of your sites. I'm going to ask that you do a data review. That what you actually do is identify how you link all of that data together. Because that's where the intrusiveness comes in. Start talking to people about how your email is linked into your session cookies and all that kind of stuff. That's where the danger lies. Then I'm going to ask you to review your policy and process, particularly how you amend or get changes onto your website. Then we're going to evaluate in context, make sure that the commercial impact is understood. And lastly, I'm going to get you to take some action. Do something. Otherwise, Dave's going to turn around and say, you're just flanneling it, guys. Okay, you can't just write about this stuff, you've got to do something. Okay, so that's it then. In summary, the process really is understand what you're currently doing, so you've got to start doing this audit and this review. How do you use and control the data in those situations? And then finally, how does it relate to the value proposition of the business? Pretty straightforward. Okay, that, ladies and gentlemen, was a very quick run through. We've got plenty of time for Q&A and all the rest of it, but that was a quick run through of the law, some of the difficulties we've come across, but also